Isolation. It's really not much more than a label that we use interchangeably with separating ourselves. But really, it means complete and utter removal from communities, friends, loved ones, and society. This kind of isolation is not only harmful to the isolated, but also to the community which they've abandoned. Using this premise, many would argue that isolation is indeed evil. With this perspective, good comes from a sense of belonging for a community, and evil comes from feeling like you don't belong in the community. In both Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, isolation is painted as a bad thing, an evil thing. Frankenstein tells the story of a young scientist, Victor Frankenstein, who, in pursuit of knowledge, isolates himself from society and creates a monster from reanimated corpses. After the monster is shunned from both his creator and by all those who look at him, making him feel as though he does not belong in any type of community, he begins a murderous rampage, killing Victor's brother, a close friend, and even his wife in an attempt to force his creator to face the same isolation that he did. This morbid tale is told by Victor after he ends up aboard a ship stuck in the Arctic after chasing the monster through the tundra. Victor tells his story to the captain of the ship, Walton, in an effort to dissuade the young adventurer from isolating himself from his crew in pursuit of knowledge of the Arctic. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner tells a similar tale of isolation and suffering. The mariner tells a lonely bridegroom his story of how he isolated himself from his crew and killed an albatross, and the penance that he is forced to pay after killing the seabird. He also tells his tale in hope that the bridegroom will not isolate himself as the mariner did, and thus will not suffer the same fate or penance that he was forced to
both feel as though they do not belong in their respective communities. Victor feels out of place in his family and does not believe he belongs at the university he attends. This feeling of not belonging impacts his logic and eventually leads him to create the monster. Similarly, the mariner does not believe that he belongs as a part of the crew, which causes his act of evil. He feels isolated from the community of sailors, so he makes the decision to act out and hurt the community. He does this by killing an albatross, which is very unlucky for sailors. Since these are both evil acts in the sense that they are against the community, both characters suffer for their decisions.
The penance through suffering that both characters go through is another major connection between the two stories. Each character makes a deliberate choice that has negative consequences, which in both of these instances involves death. As a result of Victor creating and rejecting the monster, it goes out and kills almost all of his family. These consequences leave him in a state of complete despair as he is left in the same complete isolation that he forced his creation into. We begin to see Victor's internal suffering on page 241 when he says that soon I shall die, and what I now feel be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries shall be extinct. The mariner also has a penance that he must pay for his crime against nature. After shooting the albatross with his crossbow, he is not only forced to carry it around his neck as a punishment, but also goes through otherworldly experiences in which he sees the corpses of his former crew surrounding him. Everywhere he looks, there's the many men so beautiful, and all they dead did lie, and 1,000,000 slimy things lived on, and so did I. After he faces the corpses of his former crew, he comes across two voices who judge him, saying, Is it he, is this the man, with his cruel bow he laid full low, the harmless albatross? The voices then claim that the man hath penance done, and penance more will do. These lines, appearing at the end of the fifth part of the poem, indicate the price that the mariner is paying for his decision to kill the albatross. Not only does he act out against the rest of his crew due to the feeling that he didn't belong, but he acted out against all of nature by killing this innocent bird. And now he is forced to pay the price.
The final similarities between these two stories occurs with the audience which they are talking to. They have both made deliberate decisions that have had negative consequences, and because of these choices, they had to suffer as a form of penance. After nearly facing their demise, both of these characters decide to speak out to others following a similar path in an attempt to dissuade them from facing the same fate. Before Victor begins telling his story aboard the unmoving Arctic ship, he tells Walton why he is sharing his story. I have determined at one time that the memory of these evils should die with me, begins Victor, and he continues telling Walton, You are pursuing the same course, exposing yourself to the same dangers which have rendered me what I am, and finally offers his concern as he says that nothing can alter my destiny. Listen to my history and you will perceive how irrevocably it is determined. Here Victor reveals the final outcome of his suffering, where his fate has been sealed and he is unable to change the path that his life has taken. This final stance is what causes him to reach out and talk to Walton, a younger fellow who seems to be heading down the same path that he is. However, a paradox occurs at the end of the book, as Victor encourages the crew to continue their trip into the Arctic once they're freed from the ice, despite earlier seemingly advising Walton against the pursuit of knowledge. A similar situation occurs with the fate of the mariner. When talking about his lasting fate in the seventh part of the poem, he says that, I pass like night from land to land, I have strange power of speech. The moment that his face I see, I know the man that must hear me, to him my tale I teach. He specifically warns the bridegroom by saying that, O wedding guest, this soul hath been alone on the wide, wide sea, so lonely 'twas that God himself scarce seemed there to be. Finally, as the poem comes to a conclusion, the mariner's continuous life of isolation and sorrow, summarized as he went like one that hath been stunned, and is of sense forlorn, a sadder and wiser man, he rose the morrow morn. As the mariner ends his tale and the poem draws to a close, we learn that the mariner continues to walk the earth in search of others who would suffer the same fate he did, and tell them his tale in hopes that they change their fates. The paradox that appears at the end of Frankenstein is also more clearly demonstrated as this poem draws to its conclusion. We learn that while it may appear on the contrary, Victor is actually just advising Walton against his own self-isolation, but is not suggesting any downsides to pursuing knowledge. Interesting enough, while the pursuit of knowledge and isolation went hand in hand for Victor, they're actually quite different for Walton, to the point where pursuing knowledge aboard his Arctic ship is fighting his isolation. This same idea is shown in the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, as we see that the mariner is merely meant to advise others from isolating themselves in a way that he did, but is not meant to comment on the pursuit of knowledge one way or another.
In conclusion, Frankenstein and the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner are both stories that hold similar morals. Frankenstein tells the tale of a young professor, Victor Frankenstein, who, for the sake of knowledge, isolates himself from those he is close to, his friends, his family, and his university staff, from society itself, all for the sake of creating a being from reanimated corpses. After the birth of this creation, the monster is rejected by both creator and society, and then goes on a killing spree. The monster kills Victor's family members, all in an attempt to make his creator feel the same way that he did. These are the consequences that Victor must handle as a result of his decision of isolation. After his fate has been sealed and he prepares to take his morbid tale to the grave with him, he meets Walton and tells him his tale in hopes that he will avoid making the same mistakes he did. The mariner reaches out in a similar way as Victor does. He is isolated, and because of this, he commits a crime that has severe consequences for him, filled with supernatural experiences of corpses and spirits. In an effort to turn others away from a similar fate, he tells a bridegroom his tale in hopes that it prevents his same demise. The tale of the mariner helps us clarify a paradox that occurs at the end of Frankenstein, in which it appears that Victor goes back on his word and encourages Walton to pursue his trip through the Arctic to the end. The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner helps us to clarify this issue and shows that there is nothing wrong with the pursuit of knowledge, that it's only when isolation becomes a part of it does it become evil. When the mariner speaks to the bridegroom, there is no mention of knowledge, which proves that there is only a problem with the pursuit of knowledge if it leads to isolation from society. It's difficult to see in the story of Victor, since every time he goes on a pursuit of knowledge, he isolates himself, both physically and emotionally, at the same time. This is because isolation is an act against community which hurts the community. Isolation is evil, and those who suffer the consequences of it speak out to others in hopes that they avoid making the same mistakes that they once did.